York is a city rich in Roman history. It's a history that stretches several centuries. It's a history that includes famous emperors, such as this figure, Constantine I, Constantine the Great, who was proclaimed emperor in York in 306 AD, when this city was this great centre in the north of Roman Britannia. By the time of Constantine, York had already been around for more than 200 years. And it's a story from this city's more distant past that I'm interested in today.
An intriguing mystery has stolen the limelight over the past couple of months. A mystery surrounding a group of recently unearthed, stunning bronze objects that are now subject to a new exhibition at the Yorkshire Museum, the Ryedale Hoard. But what are these objects? What do we know about them? And what's this great mystery surrounding the hoard?
Well, today I've received special access to come and see these objects and to find out how they fit into the story of Roman Yorkshire.
In May 2020, a remarkable discovery was made in a field near Ampleforth in Ryedale, North Yorkshire. The discovery was a group of 4 objects that have since been labelled some of Yorkshire's most significant Roman finds. Fast forward 2 years from the discovery, and these stunning objects are now centre stage of the Yorkshire Museum's newest exhibition. I'm meeting Yorkshire Museum's curator Dr. Lucy Crichton for a special up-close viewing of the objects.
So Lucy, you've taken out these artefacts for us today. They're quite small when you look at them, but they're incredibly stunning, aren't they?
They're absolutely spectacular. We have nothing like it in the collections of the Yorkshire Museum.
Well, let's have a look at these 4 objects now. What is this head?
The objects that make up the Ryedale Hoard are very different. Each of them's got a very different story to tell. This is perhaps the main event, this spectacular imperial sceptre head bust, probably of the Emperor Marcus Aurelius, who reigned from AD 161 to 180. And this would have been a bust that would have sat atop a sceptre or priestly staff and used during religious rituals associated with the imperial cult, the worship of the emperor as a god.
Looking at it closer now, I mean, first of all, you mentioned how 2nd century could be an Antonine emperor. But how can we tell this is potentially a depiction of an emperor from that period?
So one of the most striking features of this sceptre head is the incredibly detailed hair, each strand being individually picked out.
Yes, look at that.
And it's the hair as well as the facial features which give us the most probable subject for this portrait, Marcus Aurelius, especially that forked beard, which is shown as a characteristic feature of Marcus on other statues and coins.
Marcus Aurelius ruled the Roman Empire for almost 20 years, between 161 and 180 AD. Renowned for his stoic thinking, he has been nicknamed the Philosopher Emperor and was known as the last of the 5 good emperors.
There's so much detail in this piece and a huge amount of skill has gone into its creation. We know that this wasn't made in Rome. It's very much a provincial style. It was most likely made in Britain. The person that made this had most likely never seen Marcus Aurelius in the flesh. We don't think Marcus Aurelius ever visited Britannia, but they would have known their portrait from coins and perhaps even sculpture from Rome.
Why does this statue have such vacant eyes?
So although the eyes are hollow now, it may have been the case that originally they were inlaid with a different material, perhaps a gemstone, enamel or coloured glass to create a really piercing stare.
So there may well have been a gem, a precious jewel, on this statue in its heyday when it was perhaps part of this religious item.
Quite possibly indeed, and there are other similar examples that do have inlaid eyes.
So let's talk about some more of the detail. What else have we got on this small figurine, possibly of the Emperor Marcus Aurelius?
So the front of Marcus is definitely his best side, but if I turn him over, you can see how this object functioned. He's actually hollow at the back, and that would be to take on the staff for which this sceptre head would have sat atop. You can see here 3 rivet holes, one of them broken. We think that that's how this object would have been attached to that staff. And it's only when we look at the back that we start to appreciate how this object may have been used before it was buried.
So let's have a look at this next one, this Mars figure.
Well, this beautiful little statuette is a figure of the god Mars, depicted as a horse and rider, as he often is in Britain and Gaul. The statue is incredibly detailed. If we have a look here, we can see that Mars is wearing an impressive crested helmet, a pleated tunic, and the horse harness is fashioned in incredible detail with these decorative discs and reins.
Mars was the Roman god of war, and depictions of him were sure to emphasise this.
The object is actually incomplete. Mars would have originally been holding a shield in his left hand and brandishing a spear in his right. And really he's shown as riding into battle. Mars was particularly popular in Roman Britain, especially with the army. He was the god of war and was seen as a protective spirit who would protect soldiers in battle. Britain, of course, and especially northern Britain, was a highly militarised area with many thousands of soldiers based here. So we have lots of dedications, statuettes to, and evidence for the worship of Mars across the province.
It's absolutely stunning the amount of detail that they've packed into this really quite small object.
Indeed, and when this object was new, it would have been even more detailed and magnificent. The statue would have stood upright on a small base. And in fact, if we look closely at the horse's hooves, you can see that one of those pegs still survives that would have slotted into that base.
And Lucy, let's talk about this very, very different object in the hoard, the plumb bob.
So it might seem strange after we've looked at the beautiful statues in the hoard to focus in on this slightly less beautiful object, but actually this is one of the most interesting objects in the hoard for me. Plumb bobs were used for building projects, for measuring straight lines, and they could also be used in multiples as part of a Roman tool called a groma, which would have been used for larger landscape management projects, the laying out of a new landscape. Plumb bobs as a tool are fairly standardised in their form. They're functional, so they're made as a weight that's suspended. But this example is a particularly large and elaborate one. And also there's very little evidence of wear. It may have only been used once or twice. If we look at the top of this object, we can see how it worked. The holes here were used to suspend the object using twine on a long line.
And the hole on the side, that would also be linked up to the hole on the top to link it all together as a sort of knot, would it?
Yes, absolutely. This object is quite heavy, so you would need to be able to secure it fairly strongly. The inclusion of this plumb bob, a functional tool, in a hoard of this type is exceedingly rare. It makes the Ryedale Hoard very, very interesting. Could these objects have been buried as a blessing to aid in the success of one of these projects? And could this little plumb bob have been included as an object that was used during the project to give a certain potency to the blessing?
I mean, Lucy, it's absolutely fascinating because sometimes when you're looking at ancient Rome, you focus on religion, worship, and you focus on farming as two completely different things. So it's wonderful to be talking about these two things and seeing links through the fact that these items have been buried together.
We know that many and most aspects of Roman life were filled with religious practice, magic and ritual, but it's rare that we actually get to see the evidence of it, especially in the rural parts of our county. Magical beliefs and practices were interwoven with religion and life in the Roman period. Sometimes it's quite difficult to definitively find magical practice in the archaeological record, but there might have been magical elements to the burial of this hoard. The final object in the hoard, this little broken key, may have been believed to have magical properties and may have been included in the hoard for magical reasons. We don't know whether the object, the key, was broken before it went in the ground or whether it corroded as iron often does within the ground. If we look at this edge here, you can see the broken locking bit of the key. It may have been broken before it was buried and was included in the hoard as a broken object, which would be really interesting and hints at magical practice.
I mean, the decoration in itself is once again stunning, and it's interesting how we've got a second horse in this hoard, isn't it? You can really see this rich detail in the mane. You can see the eyes, the teeth, the mouth, the hooves, everything. It's stunning once again.
Absolutely. This key handle, as with all of the objects in the hoard, shows a real pinnacle of craftspersonship. These are some of the finest art objects from Roman Yorkshire, and it's very interesting that they've been buried all together.
Fittingly for such a stunning set of objects is the extraordinary story of their discovery. I'm meeting avid metal detectorist Mark Didlick, who, along with his friend James Spark, uncovered the hoard 2 years ago.
So Mark, talk me through the discovery of this incredible set of objects that are now on display at the Yorkshire Museum.
It was a real strange day. We'd sort of been out most of the day, and finds-wise was not a lot. And within 10 minutes of being in that field, them items were getting discovered, and it was just surreal. I mean, we couldn't even find anything similar on the internet.
So what was the first object which you and James uncovered?
It was a horse and rider. James had found it, and just looking at it, I didn't think it was Roman. I thought maybe 1,000 years old, not 1800.
And when you were unearthing these following artefacts, let's say the head of potentially Marcus Aurelius, was that head staring up at you in the ground from the earth, or how did it look like initially when you got that particular artefact out of the ground?
We actually thought it was going to be a Bronze Age axe head, because I don't know if you've noticed the bottom of the bust, it's sort of rounded.
Yes.
And the socketed axe heads are similar in shape. But we were sort of gradually just sort of picking away at the dirt, just trying to release it. Just wanted to see what it was, really. Then all of a sudden the bust just sort of fell and looked at both of us, and it just had clumps of mud in its eyes, and it was amazing. It was sort of hypnotised us, really.
The finds themselves date to the late 2nd century AD, roughly a century after York was first founded by the Roman 9th Legion in around 70 AD. Although still quite early in York's Roman history, this was an exciting time in the development of this northern bastion.
So Lucy, the Ryedale Hoard, how does it fit into the whole story, the whole chronology of Roman York? Because York in the 2nd century, it's so much more than just a military fortress, isn't it?
Absolutely. The 2nd century is almost Roman Yorkshire's golden age. The preceding 1st century, it's all about the military establishments, establishing the major fortress here at Eboracum. However, in the 2nd century, we start to see the civilian town grow and thrive. The major rich suburbs to the south of the Hughes begin to develop, and we see the establishment of stone buildings, elite dwellings, and public institutions. We know that in this period, it's where a lot of our collections here at the Yorkshire Museum come from. We see a peak in local production, so production of pottery, dress accessories and jewellery, and we also see a peak in trade and exchange. Eboracum is the centre of an empire-wide network with materials and goods coming in from France, from Italy, from all over the empire. We find evidence of them here in Eboracum.
York was really starting to grow by the late 2nd century, and it was also well connected to the surrounding countryside, to places such as Ryedale, where the hoard was discovered.
We don't know of any major buildings near the find spot of the hoard. It's the countryside. However, the Romans stamped their infrastructure across this whole region through a network of roads, forts and fortlets, and it really meant that nowhere was that far from Roman culture and influence. And we know that in the rural areas of North Yorkshire, especially in the 2nd century, major land reorganisation was occurring. Farming estates were developing, some owned by Roman veterans, some owned by wealthy locals, were being changed to incorporate new farming practices and new styles of building and technologies of estate making. So even though the fine spot of the Ryedale Hoard was very much in the countryside, we can imagine it in a countryside that was bustling and full of activity.
It therefore begs the big, all-important question: who buried this hoard of objects deep in the countryside of 2nd century Roman Yorkshire? The Yorkshire Museum has put forward 4 potential theories. The first is that it was a priest of the imperial cult, inspired by the scepter head of Marcus Aurelius.
That scepter head would have been used as a focus of worship in religious ceremonies which honoured the emperor as a god. Those ceremonies would have been carried out and overseen by specific people, priests of the imperial cult, an official role known as a Severe Augustales. And we know that these priests were living and working in York and in northern Britain. This impressive stone plaque is an inscription that was raised to commemorate the building of a new temple in Eberachem, and it records in stone the person who sponsored its building, and we can see that the inscription includes dedications to the divinities of the emperor and the goddess Hughes. A Hughes is a hitherto unknown local goddess. The stone, of course, is broken on the right-hand side, so we don't have her name, but you can see Joug, Hughes.
Another possibility is that it was a soldier that buried the hoard, an idea inspired by the Mars figurine.
Eberachem started its life as a major fortress, home to some 5,000 Roman legionaries, and the whole region is dotted with smaller military infrastructure. There would have been literally tens of thousands of soldiers in this area, and we have a wealth of archaeological evidence for soldiers living here. The stamped tiles and pottery that they produced in official workshops, hoards of coins that were buried by soldiers, burying their precious wages for safekeeping whilst they perhaps marched north on a campaign beyond the wall. It's quite possible that perhaps this hoard, the Ryedale Hoard, was buried by a soldier, perhaps as a dedication to his favourite god Mars to keep him safe. This is the finest example of religious sculpture from Roman York, quite different to the Mars in the Hoard, more classical, would have stood as a centrepiece of an elaborate temple to Mars.
Would it have been coloured? Do you think?
We think it would have been painted in bright colours, and in fact we've had some scientific analysis of the sculpture. It suggests that the fleshy bits of Mars would have been in a flesh tone, and then the rest of him would have been in bright colours, and much like our Mars.
While these objects are very special to us now, there is a chance that these items were collected purely for their material worth. And the third candidate for who buried this hoard is a metalworker who had intended on melting down the hoard for repurposing the materials.
We have on display in the exhibition objects from the largest metalworkers' hoard from Roman Britain, found in Knaresborough. Now 27 bronze vessels survive, but it originally included many, many more. And this shows the practice of hoarding metal objects, which could of course be recycled and melted down. It shows that it was happening in Roman Yorkshire, so perhaps that can be an interpretation for this hoard. This is a metalworker. This is fantastic actually. This inscription records a goldsmith's shop in Malton. It draws upon the spirit of the place, so the genius Locke, and asks the spirit of the place to bless this goldsmith shop with good luck.
The last theory proposes that the hoard was buried by a farmer, due to the inclusion of the plumb bob. This theory asks the question, why was a functional tool found alongside such different types of items? Could the hoard have been buried to bless an area of farmland, an offering to the gods so that the farmer might produce a good harvest.
The Ryedale Hoard is a fantastic reminder that religion and ritual practice was absolutely embedded into every aspect of everyday life and work for Roman people, and giving them an offering such as a votive burial of a hoard is perhaps one way that a farmer may get the gods on their side. So this is the case that explores the theme of the farmer. We have a fragment of an official document called a military diploma that soldiers upon their retirement were given. This was a diploma that was awarded to somebody specifically in the cohors second galorum, so you can get quite a lot of detail from a tiny fragment. The 4 theories that we lay out in the exhibition are just the starting point. We want visitors to explore the objects, explore the hoard, and come up with their own theories. If I had to put my money on who buried the hoard, I would err towards that story of a farmer burying the hoard to bless an act of landscape management. The reason for that is just that inclusion of the plumb bob in the hoard. It answers that question, and it's that question that makes the hoard truly unique.
These small bronze objects had rested in the ground for almost 2,000 years. Now they sit centre stage at the Yorkshire Museum, on display for people to visit and to make up their own minds as to who buried this mysterious hoard. Deservedly, they rest among Yorkshire's most significant Roman objects.
And how does it feel now to have these objects which you and James uncovered in a field not too long ago, centre stage, on display at the Yorkshire Museum?
We both wanted them to end up in York, and they've had a hell of a journey, to be honest. They're going to be there for a very long time now, and it lets everyone see them, doesn't it? There's a lot more to learn from the items as well, I think.
Well, you said there's much more to learn, so let's see what's going to happen in the future. This feels like the end of one chapter, but the beginning of a completely new chapter, so let's see.
Rich in detail, varied in purpose, and linked to an intriguing mystery, these objects might be small, but they tell an amazing story in the history of Roman Yorkshire.
Welcome to the History Hit YouTube channel. Hope you enjoyed that video.
And if you'd like to see more videos where we attempt to try and bring history to life, please don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification bell.
Cheers guys, see you soon.